Thank you, Sunil. Good afternoon, everyone. This, as Sunil said, this is the last panel session, and we were thinking that it's the one that's going to consider everything we've heard this week and then try to explore what's next. In talking about this, we can't just say we're going to do these things. We have to figure out how it's going to be implemented. How do we communicate effectively to the universe of stakeholders to ensure the CRC will be successful, useful, and sustainable? And because we're looking to the future, we are really lucky to have some of the sector's leaders in envisioning what the future will bring. So first off, we'll have Dick Luthi will talk a little bit about the ERC that they have with Stanford and University of California. Is that correct, Sunil?
Yes, with the Stanford University in California.
Okay, great. So I'll turn it over to Dick Luthi, and he'll fill us on what they're doing, and then we will get to our panel session after that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. And there we are. Does that work for everybody?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So I'm the director of the Engineering Research Center for Reinventing the Nation's Urban Water Infrastructure, or Renew It. We're in our 10th year right now, and we have a 1-year no-cost extension. Usually, there are no extensions on ERCs, but this year, because of COVID, we got a 1-year extension. So just a few comments. This is a collaboration between Berkeley, New Mexico State, and Colorado School of Mines. So we're schools located in the West where we experience water shortages and droughts. It's sort of it's a chronic problem made all the worse by climate change, population growth, ecosystem needs, and such. So I will say a little bit about Renew It, but in the context of how you might be thinking about SWIM. You need a clear vision and something that's easy to articulate and explain. And so our vision is catalyze a new type of urban water infrastructure. We want to be resilient in the face of climate change and drought, and beneficial to communities and the environment. And so that means we're not looking just at engineered solutions, but natural water infrastructure systems as well. In our field, it's important to understand how things get implemented and how change occurs. So for that, we need decision-making tools and understand also technology diffusion. A graphic that explains who we are is in these 3 blocks here. I don't know if you're required to produce this NSF ERC 3-plane diagram. That was useless as far as I'm concerned. It didn't explain anything. This is our way of explaining how we're organized. We have 3 thrusts, engineered systems on energy and resource recovery and potable reuse, natural water infrastructure systems, looking at wetlands and riparian zones, managed recharge, and stormwater use. But then that's overlain by urban systems and integration, decision tools, regional planning, and technology diffusion. Key to us, and I think to any ERC, is that you have a very engaged industrial advisory board and partners. And for us, the best engagement comes with test beds. Right now we have 14 current test beds. Some are, we've had other ones in the past that are not used now, but 14 current. I was trained as a chemical engineer, and I think these as pilot systems. Something at scale outside the university lab, where you can really demonstrate a new approach. Now, this requires a lot of engagement by IAB folks because there isn't enough money to build things. You know, a test bed that might be either a wetland system or new kind of engineered facility, you have to have a lot of partners to help make that go. So this is a key thing, and this is where we've had our best impact, is working at these at scale. Now, this is not full scale. It's it's a step along to full scale, but it's at a scale that after this test bed, it can be demonstrated at a much larger scale. And a utility partner could take it and then run with it. On Monday, I listened to the opening discussions, and I want to say a few words about education work or engineering workforce development and the diversity and inclusion. We have a very active group and culture that's engaged in education and outreach activities. And this requires that faculty have buy-in, not that just they sort of bless it and say, yeah, that's nice, but actually commit time. When you get a review, this is something everyone will have an opinion on. When you have a review, not everyone will know about stormwater capture for water supply, or maybe electrodialysis and its role for desalination. But everyone will have an opinion about education and outreach. And I can't emphasize the importance of this, of having good leadership here, good staff support, and everyone contributing to make it work. And this is part of the community building of a center. And the other one is the diversity and culture of inclusion. Here, really important. Again, with NSF site visit, this is something that will get a lot of attention. And it doesn't matter what kind of a center you are. Again, everyone can have a sense about diversity and inclusion. What I learned was that the students really will get engaged on this, and that we've learned so much from the students, and embracing student initiatives that has really benefited our center so much. Early on, we had it was more faculty led. Here, it's actually more student led. We also do climate surveys, and I encourage you to think about that. And we share the results with our site visit team. We don't have a way to benchmark one climate survey against another, except to show how things are evolving over time. But this is part of being open and above board, and knowing where things are working and where things may need improvement. No one's perfect. And again, I'll just mention the importance of everyone knowing the value and taking concrete steps, and having each year some metrics by which you can judge your success, both in education and outreach, and diversity and culture of inclusion. On the research side, a lot of that takes care of itself, because professors are so, that's kind of what they do. But it's these larger dimensions that make a center function that require attention, thoughtfulness, and engagement at all levels. I want to say a few words now about just looking ahead, somewhat more along the line of the theme of the SWIM Center. We're in our 10th year. What I'm looking forward to is how to think about sustainable water management in California beyond the urban sector, and I'm helping to lead discussions at Stanford about that. So when I look at kind of what's next for us, we're sort of touching maybe on some of the themes for the SWIM Center, looking at 4 areas. One is resilient urban water supplies, look at agriculture in small communities. We have irrigated agriculture in the state. You know, the San Joaquin Valley and is probably the most productive agricultural region in the country. We need to pay a lot of attention to ecosystems and environmental flows that they've gotten the short end of the stick in the past. And we need to have policies and management so that we can best manage water for cities, agriculture, small communities, and the environment. To help inform our thinking on this, at least in the Bay Area, we have engaged a group of folks. We call it a Bay Area One Water Network. Now, we'd like to do something bigger than this, but this engages 10 counties in the greater Bay Area. And this is Renew It led. Well, it's led by Berkeley and Stanford, I should say, because we're in the Bay Area, with Dave Sedlak and myself. And this is a clearinghouse for stakeholders and water managers in the region to share information, build collaborative capacity, and develop strategies for implementing resilient integrated water systems. A lot of talk about integrated water systems and such, and integrated watershed management. But when it gets down to say what's really being done, there's a lot of retrenchment into jurisdictional silos, hard for things to cross city boundaries or county boundaries and that kind of thing. But looking to the future, we're going to think a lot more about collaborative work. So I'd like to finish by looking ahead and thinking about what's on the horizon. And if we were going to do a Renew It 2, what would we be thinking about? Well, one way I decided to frame this was to think about what are the future drivers? You know, where will we be in, say, 2050? And how should that inform decisions today? So I'm going to be California centric here, okay? One is less imported water. Our imported water is snowmelt from the Sierra, and it gets used various ways. But there are a lot of stresses on that. We need to leave more water for ecosystems. So one is less imported water. How much less? We don't know exactly, but if I said 50% less, 50% less, that's not out of the question. And of course, that would be very huge when most cities have only two sources of water, imported water and groundwater. Another one is for the big cities in California. We're along the coast, and there's movements to stop ocean discharge. You know, we heard about Hampton Roads earlier and the SWIFT project. You know, imagine doing that at scale where someone may say, hey, we're going to stop all ocean discharge and we're going to reuse that water. What does that mean? The other thing that's happening is that reuse is getting easier. For both potable and non-potable purposes, and also between small scale and big scale. We also need to be paying attention to our urban adaptation investments, adaptation for climate change, and for disadvantaged communities. We don't usually think about how the big investments in our water infrastructure will benefit underserved communities, but we'll see more of that in future planning. So to wrap up then, just two examples. The driver number 2 on limits on ocean discharge. Here's one of our state senators saying that, you know, by 2050, we should reduce our ocean discharge of wastewater by 95%. Well, that's 1 billion gallons a day is what he's talking about. Will this happen by 2040? Probably not. But does this point to the way politicians are thinking? We've heard about that before in the previous session. Yes, we should be ready for that. Now, what does that mean if I want to do ecosystem habitat restoration? I don't know quite how that fits in. But this is the kind of thing you'll say, you look at it and say, wow, how do we prepare for that? And along the way, if we manage our stormwater and for water supply and think about how we can best capture our wastewater, we benefit the ocean environment as well. And then the example about easier reuse. The state of California has been a leader in developing standards for non-potable and potable reuse. And along the way, we've been engaged, Renew It has been engaged with the EPA in helping to develop the National Water Reuse Action Plan. And our fingerprints are on this document. It started with some meetings we had at the Johnson Foundation or Wingspread, facilitated workshops. This document's not complete. It doesn't address stormwater sufficiently, but it's where we see regulations helping to make things easier going forward. And then when I talked about scales and types, I just want to show you the Facebook campus here, where they recycle about, it's on the order of about maybe 40,000 gallons a day of wastewater running through a system that essentially produces potable water. And you can see it here. This is an example of decentralized water reuse. Now, they don't use it for drinking purposes. They use it for other purposes around the Facebook campus. But this is interesting about it's not just all at your big treatment plants. Lastly, in the state, we have a lot of water used for irrigated agriculture, and we need to think how irrigated agriculture will work to prevent groundwater overdraft, and how small communities that aren't connected to a municipal supply, how they will be better served in the future. So when I look at agriculture in small communities, it's groundwater overdraft, it's groundwater quality, it's social justice. And here, just like we do with our utility partners in our own like 10 county region, we have to have this hands-on, bottom-up approaches in working with these smaller communities in the Central Valley. And lastly, about the water grid and linkages, and this is more swim scale stuff. How can regions share and create partnerships? And I think by regions, it could be Bay Area, it could be LA County, Orange County, San Diego. Then you could think larger, the peri-urban interface, Monterey, Salinas, Fresno, places like that. And then work across states even. How would that work? And that's, that think Colorado River Basin. And then the comments I've heard is this idea about focusing on the water grid and adaptation, that ties together these three elements that I mentioned, ag, urban, and ecosystems. And lastly, how do we deal with volatility in both floods and droughts? And I think California has probably the most extreme hydrologic cycle of anywhere in the US. We had a back-to-back droughts, and then we had a couple of very wet years. Now, last year was a drought again, and we don't know quite what this year is going to bring, but that's the nature of the beast here in California. So that's all I have. I wanted to give words of encouragement, and also, try to emphasize some heartfelt comments about where to pay attention. And then also be forward-looking. So I'll put a question out there, for your swim center, what would you like the water systems to look like in the year 2050? And how will your center help get us there? I'll just leave that for you all to ponder. But if I were on a visiting committee, I might ask that kind of question. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thanks, Dick. That was really informative. Walter?
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you very much, Dick. Really appreciate your remarks there. And it's a great closing question, because I think that's one we're going to try to get to here. Next, Sunil will give a few remarks, and then we will get straight to our panel session.
Right. Yeah, so I will share my screen, Walter. You can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so what I planned is, and it's great that Dick has started, and because he has a center which is coming into the graduation, what NSF called 10-year, they got 1-year extension. But that's very important to learn from Dick and hardcore questions. So what I have done is I have summarized what these 4 days we have. We started with Monday, workshop of workshop, and then we have the whole conference dedicated with the theme of Smart One Water. So I will quickly go, I will not go each slide because you have seen many times some of these slides. So the concept of one water, looking as a three-dimensional build system, natural, socioeconomic, not just because a lot of federal initiative, let me tell you, is going on in the natural side. But there is a lot of interdependencies between built and natural. We cannot keep measuring water at the source. So that's kind of a concept. Then coming here, we got a lot of feedback how we can improve this figure, which basically digital transformation one. So we talked about that. Then the core pillar is what Dick was talking is from Stanford. I believe, Dick, if I'm right, the Stanford is generation 2. So I don't know where this whole pillars was there or not: convergent research, innovation ecosystem, workforce development, stakeholder, diversity and culture of inclusion. But looks like what Dick mentioned is at that time also they had to pay attention on stakeholder diversity, innovation, workforce development, and convergence. So that's kind of a we talked a lot. We had the each workshop, and then Monday we talked about that. We also talked about the near term, what we will do, midterm, long term, and now what Dick is saying is that after finishing of NSF 10-year journey, what will happen after that? They don't want the center. Nobody wants any center to collapse. So how we move forward, and whatever Dick is saying, future going, it fits very well with what we are trying to do so that we can be complement to the efforts with existing center. So we went through that. We had the whole swim conference we organized. We talked everything. So now we are in the final to talk path forward. We talk who's the stakeholder. There are many. We got a lot of comment on that. We talked about this workforce, and Dick also mentioned about that. This is what, if they come for the site visit, they will pay attention to this, the whole workforce development. We did talk about this, our vision of what we are going research. So it's not just about workforce and innovation ecosystem. There's a hardcore research also is going to take place. So our product is a digital product. Dick mentioned about his ERC, which is a reuse, other ERC is producing. So this is our final product, what we are claiming it SOD as, the Smart One Water Digital Analysis and Integrated Management System, which is a very complex platform which can support AI on all those platforms. So left-hand side is more data analytic. Right-hand side, it has to be AI-ready data and AI models and tools so that we can do analytic as a scale. The other key challenge we want to discuss now today is how we will implement this. We have ideas, we have partnered with Delaware River Basin, other basin also, but these are very complex boundaries. If you look at that, there are 800 utilities in that basin. So how to do at this scale to implement what we are envisioning, and again, Dick mentioned about the vision has to be clear. So this is our vision, but how to implement that is also the key. Dick said, even I don't like this 3-plane chart, but we have to. This is a requirement. So we will come back to the stakeholder because this is very important. From NSF, they want to see that from bottom is the fundamental, then enabling technology, and how you implement into the test bed. So I discussed earlier, this is our product, which we will implement, but how this will go, and that's what this 3-plane chart is saying. So I want to just throw it there. Nobody likes it, but that's a requirement. So what to do? So I will just stop here and hand over, Walter, to you. I know some slide, but everything will be available on the website after this. But this is what really I want in this session to discuss is how we can implement the vision, what we have of a Smart One Water. Thanks, Walter.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sunil. Okay, so now we will get to our panel session here, and what I'll do is I'll introduce each of our speakers, and then I will ask each one to give their opening thoughts. So first we have George Hawkins, President of Moonshot Missions. We have Hardeep Anand, who is Deputy Director, Capital Improvements at Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Department, and Joe Manis, Director, Institute for Water Resources at US AEC. So first I'll ask Joe, would you like to start off with this?
Sure. I assume you can hear me okay.
Yes.
I will build off of Dick's presentation and talk about the idea of education and information flow. I think it's a continual challenge in all infrastructure, and water just being one sector, where people do not appreciate uh, the need for investment and for better or more appropriate management of the resources we have. We can come up with all kinds of wiring diagrams, flow charts, hierarchies, but at the end of the day, what really matters are the people who are going to pay for this. Are they going to buy into it? I mean, that's what it comes down to. And we have traditionally not been extraordinarily successful at doing that. There have been successes, clearly, and I don't want to diminish those, but there needs to be a better collaboration, a better coordination, a better communication with those constituents to help them make better informed decisions. I'll offer a couple of specifics. Education, and this gets back to Dick's comment, but education has to start not at the time we need to make a decision, but educating people so that they are comfortable with the idea that certain types of infrastructure, and in this case we're talking specifically water, that water infrastructure has value and that they can internalize what the value is. One of the best examples I have is, well, there's actually two. One is wearing seatbelts. I can remember when we didn't wear seatbelts. They were in the cars, or some cars didn't have them. But then all of a sudden we had a campaign where people wore them. They passed laws, and yeah, people could get tickets. But it came a time when children and younger people said, "Why aren't you wearing it?" And that kind of education informs us. And then there was the litter campaign that started in the 70s, about picking up trash. And today we do that. You'll get chastised by folks if you start throwing litter on the ground. It does happen, I get it, but that's how you get people aware and they internalize the value of something. We need to be involved with the broader budgeting discussions. We too often talk within our sector. In this case, talking about water. I want to talk to you, Mr. Congressman, about the water issue. Well, the congressman's talking about water, and he's got a whole list of other things and a whole bunch of other people waiting outside their door. We need to be conversant on what it is that this infrastructure or this type of investment is competing with. How does it play into human services or other or the social programs? How does it play into immigration or defense or any of the others? Because if we're leaving it up to others to weigh the value of one opportunity against the other, then they're going to choose what they want, and we need to help them make those decisions more effectively. We focus the messages on topics that the consumers can internalize. Again, getting back to the idea of wiring diagrams, future benefits for generations, there is a segment of society that understands that and appreciates it. But my experience has been most of society looks at that as being somebody else's problem, not theirs. And so we need to tie, particularly fresh water is a good topic, how the investment in whether it's flood mitigation or if we're talking about potable water, impacts on health, how does that impact individuals so that they can see themselves in that challenge? And then we have to sustain this communication over time. It's not enough to surge and say, well, how did we do? We've got to go into it for the long haul. We've got to impart it into elementary education, middle school education, as well as at the same time educating the adults and people that are making decisions in elected and appointed positions. So it takes a broad effort to get people informed. And I think that is the challenge, is how do we sustain something over time? Because everything takes money. There's a limited amount, but we continue to fret that we don't get the responses we need because people still never quite understand what it is we're asking. I'll stop there and pass it off to somebody else.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Joe. That was a good start off to the session. Hardeep, would you like to go next?
Sure. Okay, let me see if I'm not muted. Yes. Well, I think Joe hit it on the head, and quite a few of the things that he has mentioned. I'm pleased to say that they've been recognized, and I'll start off with what I normally end, that genesis of the academy was precisely so. Education, communication, having sustainable conversations over time, not at budget time, but all through the year. And some of the main focus points that I think he talked about, if I can expand a little bit on that, is the value of the work that we do with respect to our infrastructure projects and tying them to the community that we serve. What hits them directly is the pocketbook, right? At the end of the day, it's the ratepayers. They're the ones who are paying the money. And then the conversations that we have, as Joe said, we do an awesome job in communicating and conversing within ourselves. We probably don't do a very decent job in bringing other stakeholders inside these conversations, folks from procurement, folks who serve as elected officials and policymakers and decision makers. And that conversation, if it's held sustainably over time, then at budget time, it becomes very much easier for us to be able to shepherd those projects that are important. The second point I would make is going back to the pocketbook of the community we serve and championing of projects. I think we've come to a point in time where it's no longer enough for us to prioritize projects and look at them in an abstract sense, that this is what it costs us to do this project, meaning this is the labor, this is the equipment, and this is the materials, right? We've got to tie them to the triple bottom line of this is the social benefit, this is the environmental benefit, and this is the economic benefit, right? And then we've got to go further from just being objectively talking about benefits into quantifying those benefits into the bottom line, which is the dollar, which is the pocketbook, which is what resonates with the policy decision makers to champion the projects, as well as the communities we serve. And there are tools out there, without mentioning specific tools, there are tools out there that do that, thankfully, today. And I think we've got to integrate into those conversations. So I'm going to stop there to piggyback on some of the thoughts with Joe, and happy to add more as the conversation progresses.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hardeep. Okay, George, it's up to you to wrap up the opening statements, and then we will open it up for the audience to continue this discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Walter. And it's a delight to be on this panel with Joe and Hardeep, both of whom I respect tremendously. I'll start with a short story. I've been doing watershed work in New Jersey back in the 90s, and there was an effort by the state to do full watershed planning for the entire state and have that then radiate out into zoning and all the rest. And it was so complex because there were so many pieces. And this was despite the support from Christy Whitman, who then goes on to become EPA administrator after being governor at the time of New Jersey, that the whole program fell apart. And a few years after it had been kicked off to great fanfare and actually a fair amount of investment, it didn't yield the results that were sought. At the time, I was running a watershed group that was a part of a sub-watershed in central New Jersey. And we argued for a different perspective that looked at issues more narrowly. How can you define topics that we can get a handle on? Sort of connecting to what Hardeep or what Joe said of connecting into people understand what could be part of schooling, what could have a pocketbook issue. That means narrowing. And what I've really realized over time from that experience is that neither is right, but both are right. Which is if you have small scale focused projects by themselves that are not connected to an overall concept, you can have lots of activities that don't add up in total to something bigger than each piece. Yet if you if you only are spending a lot of time, I look at those, Sunil, those charts that you showed, and they're sort of bedazzling in their scale and complexity of what on earth does that mean to anybody? Even someone who's pretty well versed it takes a long time just to figure out what all the words are, let alone what that all means and how it fits. But so there's somewhere in between. And there's so much that I would think an ERC can do by attacking both, but have them connected. a university I won't name that I've been affiliated with, I always get frustrated by their basic research that they're doing, not because it's not important, but how does it connect to and inform what folks who are working in the field are doing when it's often separate. And what the ERC has the opportunity is to connect. And I think it's 3 I's are some focus areas I would suggest. The first is integration. I personally don't think there's a big technology problem in the water industry right now. Technology is evolving quickly. As Sunil, you said, there's so much research being done, or maybe that's what Dick said. That's what universities do. We did it in concert with Virginia Tech at DC Water. Technology is advancing quickly. You've seen all week long all the opportunities are out there. The integration of technologies is a mess. And it's not allowing any particular operating entity to really realize the benefit of the whole, because pieces often not only don't integrate well, they fight among themselves and they don't communicate. And sometimes the sum is worse. The second I, to me, is implementation. And I think an ERC, just like Dick focused on in California ERC with Stanford about issues that are local, not local, but significant to the West. Virginia Tech is here on the East Coast, it's near Washington, DC. Maybe there should be a focus on implementation. And that means, as you had on some of the slides, Sunil, what about procurement and how does that hold up this technology adoption? What about how governance of various styles can support or engage this kind of change or not? And how do you connect those kinds of questions with the outcomes that are deserved? And the last I would say is impoverished. I'm fascinated by pictures of what Facebook has done or Apple's new campus, but those are the most wealthy and the most powerful organizations virtually in the country, if not the whole world. What about the thousands of small and impoverished communities, which arguably need these technologies the most? How do we use our assembled brain power to create the templates and the procedures and the practices and the systems to enable places that don't have that kind of initial financial resource to gain access to these solutions that really are remarkable? I mean, what we've seen all week are remarkable stories. And how do we deliver those into some of the places that are impoverished and arguably need them the most? So I'm excited for the rest of the panel, and turn it back to you, Walter.
Okay, thank you, George, Hardeep, and Joe. That was great. Does anyone have any questions from the audience to ask our panelists?
This is Dave Dezombach. Maybe I'll pick up right where George finished on the third I, impoverished, and it connects to something Dick Luthi was talking about including part of his remarks, engaging small communities. We've had a lot of discussion this week at the swim conference about research that the center might do and how it connects to small communities, resource poor, impoverished, as George called them. And maybe I'd ask Dick Luthi, I'm sure this has been, obviously from your slides, it's been thought about in the Renew It Center, how to connect what you're doing in city of Los Angeles and other places, large urban centers, with the needs of small communities. This is something the planning group for the ERC has been grappling with, and we heard in spades this week, and just from George too.
Well, Dave, we are working with this problem as well, trying to move from the urban environment to the smaller communities in the San Joaquin Valley. And I had on my slide that some of those, are, many of them, I guess you could say, are not connected to a community water system, or like Fresno, say, or Bakersfield. And in some cases, I said it's almost like third world situation. So we're working on that. But when I think about disadvantaged communities, I look also in the Bay Area and Los Angeles and the like, and where I've seen some big investments take place is where you will think about an urban water system and all the co-benefits that can go with it. And one example we've worked with is how to work with LA Department of Water and Power in converting a former gravel pit that frankly is just a big urban blight, and to convert that into a stormwater capture recharge system. So it's water supply for the city, but at the same time, you can bring elements of like a park in an area that doesn't have parks. You can make greenscape and stuff like that, put in a soccer field and tennis court on this big site. And Dave, part of that then is you have a picture here of what it can be. I don't think I showed, it was on one of my slides. It was that one of the one about the urban infrastructure where it was a sketch. But anyway, the point is the tree people got behind that. It sounds like a funny group, but they're very, very powerful environmental group in LA. Surf riders got behind it because if we could capture stormwater and not polluting. Sierra Club got behind it because, you know, its water supply is not desal. Then you had Council for Watershed Health, and you had Sun Valley, that's neighborhood community groups, all got together. And then things happen. And, you know, these are big investments, but it worked because there was a coalition of the willing. And I can't emphasize enough that at the end of the day, it was water supply, but it worked in all these other dimensions as well. And we've heard about mayors and George, you were with DC Water, you know the importance of this. You know, you get these community groups, mayors listen to them, and then you say, hey, this is a good thing to do. And it can grow. So I guess I've had my ear to the ground in the urban environment, Dave, not as much in the Central Valley, though I know a lot about the big water banking operations out there, but I want to learn more about that and what we can do. And it's an area that, to be honest, that Stanford has not worked in before. And it's an opportunity for us in the future.
Thanks, Dick. George, I don't know if you want to add anything on to that.
Well, I love the question and the focus. My experience, and the reason I left DC Water is because I love my team there, and it was a great crew. By the way, we did a lot of work with Virginia Tech, among other universities. Is this question of how to help utilities that have less resources adopt and adapt the kind of strategies that DC Water was able to do. We're not smarter or not better. We had scale, and we had a pretty good revenue base in a growing city. And what I'm discovering is that most of the utilities that are smaller, I call impoverished. I don't mean just financially, impoverished for resources. They don't have just often scale. They're running more like fire departments than infrastructure planning agencies, because when you're behind on, you're just responding to the next crisis as it comes up, which, by the way, is very alluring, because when you have a crisis, everybody drops everything. You know what you have to do. You roll your trucks. There's a certain adrenaline that comes with it. You can get used to that, but it's expensive. It's tough on your ratepayers. You have liability problems. It means you're responding to problems. We all know the problems that those are. And the question is, they're not able to lift their head up and see what's possible. And how can we digest the kind of research that we've done into easily replicable modules that we can implement in these places based on practices that have already been accomplished in other places? And how can we help on that front? Because I think it's making them digestible, and I think it was, I can't remember who was focusing so much on cost. Oh, Hardeep, you were talking about the pocketbook question. That what I found at DC Water is we had created a competition among our programs to bring forth innovative ideas that save money. And the division would get to save some of that money to use for whatever they needed it for. And all of a sudden, they started popping up because there was an incentive within the enterprise to do that kind of work to gain flexibility. For one of these utilities to implement the first project and see what the outcome is and see the story they have to tell. They're no longer just coming to your door because there's a water main break as a fire department. They're coming with a story of a positive energy outcome and reduction in cost. Then that's a feedback loop that then becomes a culture of replication. And how we do that with lots of utilities, I would think an ERC focus on that would be tremendously valuable.
Thank you, George.
I have a question here from John Green who would like to ask the panel.
Thank you, Walter. I guess what I'd say is that I think it's along a similar line of George's points, is that, you know, we've got this compelling vision that Sunil has has developed, and I think most of us are bought in and saying, yeah, we ought to do that. But it appears to me that one of the things that's going to be necessary for that to happen is that we're going to have to develop some wins along the way. And I'd like some ideas for what are some of the quick wins that we might go after, either I would say early in the ERC or even before the ERC is authorized.
Joe, you're muted.
All right, thank you. I would say that we need to walk before you run. Pick a watershed, not a tiny one, but a medium-sized one, and look at the various things you want to try. And then I know this has been done hundreds of times, but if you're going to move forward and look at different approaches, that's what makes it different. So you have a watershed, and you're looking at applying the technology, but also looking at informing people to see how much they're willing to buy into what you're trying to do. But the other thing that's extraordinarily key is the vertical alignment of the different resources. I mean, the federal government has their own rules for how they approach these issues, state government and in local communities. And those roles and responsibilities currently don't really mesh. They overlap and they have gaps. And I think part of the conversation is how do you address to where the gaps in the approach exist? And how do you get everybody working in a common direction? I think everybody on the call is familiar with those challenges, but inherently that's part of it. I'm convinced that the way forward is better communication so that people buy in and support these initiatives, and they don't come from single voices that represent a minority, but you get a lot of people that can see the value. If they don't see the value, then there you're right back to where we are. But I think could be one of the metrics, one of the goals you search for is how many people, how many groups can you get involved and engaged in moving, whether it's a flood risk reduction or a water quality problem or a water quantity problem. How do you address that, and who do you get involved, and how do you approach it using the tools that already exist?
I'd like to comment, Joe, you have really good points there. I'll speak from the university perspective. It's a little challenging sometimes to get faculty to work together. They're very independent. And so one thing I've learned at Renew It is a way to get faculty to work together is think about joint papers and joint projects. So we don't have standalone projects. And the best projects, the best field work that's been done is where you have faculty investigators at different campuses. And this has been a kind of a hallmark for me, saying there's got to be multiple investigators, and you need the buy-in from one of our major utility sponsors that will get behind and support it. If I could, I would like to just get back to Dave Dazan back here for a minute. I want to do one little thing, and I'm going to just share a screen for a second. And this gets to George's point. This is the Sun Valley neighborhood in Los Angeles, lower part of the San Fernando Valley. Interesting neighborhood. When you look at this picture here, what's missing? What's missing is there are no sidewalks and there's no stormwater infrastructure. So one project we've been working on is how to work with the city of Los Angeles in implementing dry wells. Dry wells would collect that water, put it in the ground. And our work here is really trying to understand how to improve that water quality before it goes in the ground. This is a demonstration project here where the city's put in a few of these. But what do you see here now? You see a sidewalk, you see curbs, you see a little bit of plantings and stuff. Kids can ride their bicycles here now and not worry about going off into Laurel Canyon Boulevard. This is the kind of thing that, while this is small, 10 or 15 acre feet a year, this facility, the idea is to put hundreds of these throughout the San Fernando Valley. And you can see how an idea like this, how you go from that to this, that say, wow, it almost sells itself. But the secret here too is finding where the university research can make a difference. And in swim, it would be like, well, do I need the modeling and the decision-making tools, or it's something else? But I wanted to just put that out there as the example of kind of like where you can, with a small project, you can make a difference and you can expand from there. So George, I'm going to say that a project you can get your hands on, get a hand on is right. But then at the same time, you say, how's this going to build out and work? And what will it mean if I do hundreds of these throughout the San Fernando Valley? And you say, whoa, I want to make sure I'm not contaminating that groundwater. But I don't know if that was inspiring. It's inspiring to me.
Thanks. Here's a quick question. What should the ERC create? An urban regional system or a regional group of smaller communities?
I'm not sure if I understand the question fully, Walter, frankly. I mean, it probably is beyond my comprehension, but can you expand on that a bit?
Okay.
This is Ken Thompson. I'll expand on it. There's some great examples of urban regional systems that have been operating very effectively, like the Orange County Water District in Southern California. But there's not a lot of examples of smaller communities that have formed together to work together to create a more regional approach to, in this case, Smart One Water. As a starting point, obviously the ERC wants to look at all systems of all sizes, but would an early win be to form one of these regional groups of smaller communities to show how effective you are at work with the workforce, the governance, and the technology? Would that be more effective than working with utilities that are already larger groups that are already very innovative?
If I can take a crack at that, and piggybacking on what George and others had spoken, from our ecosystem standpoint, I'll speak in the context of where I come from, Miami-Dade. The county has 34, 35 cities, and we look at it as being at ground zero. And we also look at it as regional resilience, right? We're not looking at Miami-Dade County or the city of Miami as becoming a resilient community. And when you start looking at all the 33, 34, 35 cities, the level of sophistication, if that's the word I can use, is probably different depending on the size and magnitude of the budgets of these cities. Along with that goes the level of knowledge and know-how and all the other things that it takes to make a system on its whole resilient. So when you look at the ERC, and depending on what the span and control of the future ERC is going to be, whether it's national or whether it is regional in some ways, but assuming it's national, and if I'm, let's say, a public works director, remember in some of these cities, utilities are embedded under public works. And that's where the firefighting mentality probably sometimes comes from. And in some of the cities, they are standalone as a utility. So when you come from a small city and you don't have the bandwidth of going after learning and curating all of these tools and resources and knowledge bases to operationalize resiliency in the sense of the projects that we put out, then you're going to be looking forward to some sort of an entity, some sort of an organization that could help you curate it so that you can incorporate that knowledge base into your projects, and then at the end of the day, operationalize those projects. Because let's face it, that is where the rubber hits the road. The talking has to stop at some point, and what really impacts the community, the quality of life, businesses, tourism, what have you, is getting these things done. So making those connections for smaller utilities from smaller cities, being able to network and communicate and be able to get that information in somewhat of a real time without spending a lot of money on consulting efforts and consulting studies is what the real trick on the ground is. And I speak that from my vantage point in the community, trying to get things done. Not sure if it answered the question.
If I could add to what Hardeep says, and I think there's a tremendous amount of what Hardeep and I have had these conversations in the past and a great agreement on it. But here's the challenge, because this organization I've created is a nonprofit called Moonshot Missions, and we're formed to help impoverished communities adopt these. What we found with smaller communities is really interesting, is they're so similar to large communities. Water systems scale in what they have. They're smaller treatment plant, but there's still primary treatment, there's secondary treatment, except for the really small community systems. They have a distribution system and maybe a pump station. They don't have as many, but the same issues crop up. And the challenge with working with small communities is there's thousands of them. And it actually takes a lot of effort to help one little community as it does to help a bigger one where there's more people. And then you start thinking, well, where are my time and effort best placed? But when you bring communities together, because I love that idea that Hardeep is, rather than 25 different communities looking at the same question, how could we reduce non-revenue water? How can we put more of our wastewater when it's clean back into the groundwater? How can we, instead of each one doing that, how can we band together and as a group go through a process that we're doing this at the same time, sharing the costs and sharing the effort so that any one of us are not overwhelmed? And who can convene? Because what we have found when communities come together, it's Friday night football rivalries. I mean, there's all sorts of fascinating challenges between who's going to be in charge. Well, if there is an ERC that is a neutral ground that is bringing the data and information necessary to make good decisions that everyone can come, then a regional group of utilities that are small but could adapt, review, select, sharing costs and sharing implementation with the guiding hand of all the resources that our ERC could bring to bear. I think that's a tremendous prospect.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I appreciate it. It's great.
I would throw out one thing that it seems less important about what types of organizations you pull together. I mean, I understand the issue of scale, that's extraordinarily relevant, but who's willing? I think that may be the more important consideration. And of course, willingness comes along with people's acceptance or understanding of what the possibilities are. We do a lot of collaborative work and assisting others with collaborative work. And we had a fellow who worked here who some of you probably know, but he would send out a survey in advance of getting together with a group to try to help them work to find a common solution. And he said he could tell, by looking at the surveys in advance, very short, just sort of overarching sort of input, whether or not the collaborative effort would be successful, because people have to be willing to do this. And that's, I think, part of the challenge is to work with those that are willing to move it forward and use that success to incentivize those who are more hesitant.
Thanks. Pierre, have you got anything to say about these quick wins?
Yeah, I actually, I totally agree with what Joe just said. I think it's great to have, demonstrations of really impressive technology and things like that for like maybe what you might do for a larger community. The problem was that, and so I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, right? But the problem with that is that if it's going to be hard for smaller communities they might be impressed by that level of technology, by that achievement and so forth. NSF might be impressed, might renew your ERC or give you more funding. But in terms of getting affecting societal change in a big way, it's going to be a lot easier for people in small communities to see, a win that happens in a community that has, some of the same conditions that they do, and for them to kind of like, get that story, see how, it could be that particular win could be implemented in their own community, internalize that information and then spread like wildfire. And so it might not get you, you know, the bigger NSF grant, or, you know, might not be like, you know, going to the moon, right? That high shine, you know, high scientific and technological accomplishment, but it might have a lot of impact. And so I think we kind of have to balance those two things, right? And so in terms of getting quick wins, I would argue that, you know, some of the maybe easier, maybe simpler wins might have a lot of power in their own right.
Okay, great. What is the main hook to distinguish this ERC from another water industry initiative without university involvement?
Walter, you mean what would be distinguishing the ERC from other organizations that exist today?
Yeah, I think that's what he's getting at. It's just like other water
Yeah.
industry initiatives.
Yeah, you know, I can take a crack at that. And if you take a look at a large utility and you talk about smart water, it encompasses everything from asset management to water quality to workforce development, and all the different things we talk about. And if you look at most of the other organizations, they're not in the space of, if I can use the word, of really being able to, you know, scale knowledge and be able to curate knowledge. So for instance, let's say Miami-Dade has a use case that is a challenge. Today we talk about Biscayne Bay, and we talk about fish kills, and we talk about algae blooms. And there's a lot of conversation. The county commission constituted a task force. There's a great report that was put out by the task force. Now we've got to make sure we operationalize it. And we talk about sensors, we talk about you know, water quality monitoring, dashboards, governance, everything that, you know, is being discussed today and on the previous days here at this conference. So if the ERC can assist or play a role where some other successful use case, somewhat similar to the challenges we face with the Bay, can be put forth or at least be available, then the time that we spend in experimenting and researching and piloting can be drastically cut. And all of that translates in, all of that time translates into money, and it translates into that trust and credibility factor, both with the policymakers and the communities we serve, because then it translates again into that impact on the ground in terms of affecting tourism or public health and so on and so forth, right? So in my opinion, we had been thinking about doing something like this in this part of the world, right, within the county. And I think if there's something that could be taught from that standpoint to address the needs of a utility, a city, large or small, then I think that would go a long way, A, but B, I think that would be a huge distinguishing factor between, let's say, the ERC and some of the other organizations that exist today.
As usual, I like what Hardeep is saying, and my answer to that, not that I have a great one, because I think it's a very interesting question. There's a lot of water initiatives that I suspect it will be similar to, but the reason I liked partnering with Virginia Tech, for example, when I was at DC Water, is the enormous level of intellectual resources that were at hand that could move quickly. So we had access to this vast array, and then I think that those huge charts that Sunil was showing with all the various pieces and connected to here and there inside the university of a scale like Virginia Tech or the places that are part of this, there's access to so many. I recognize that, as Dick said, not all the professors work together or all the programs work together, but to move quickly to put students who are at the moment in their careers where they're interested in learning and they're sort of engaged in the opening of all these new ideas that are connected to impact, of how quickly we could get to, here's what a problem is, here's what our challenge is, and connect it to either solutions that already existed that ERC is aware of, or immediate research and the ability to apply knowledge to the problem at hand. And I was astonished while I was there how many projects. We usually had between 20 and 30 PhD level projects going on at DC Water, connecting into university resources. But it was that collaboration. What's happening? How quickly can we respond? Let's get a team on it. How can we move? And we were giving something to the students that was value to them. They were learning. The ERC structure seems to me to be that persona, or created organizationally in a way that could be really really powerful.
Yeah, I think also one thing that I've learned from this week and from working with this for a while is that work that's done in one area will be able to complement other areas. So it won't just be a particular project. It'll also have a social value tied to that, getting towards a triple bottom line type application of work that this ERC does.
But as I look back at the question, the original question, it talks about with another water industry initiative. I come back to what we've already discussed. I think the situational awareness or education, whatever term you want to use, but again, going back to the as mentioned by George and Hardeep, is using the university resources to develop how do we communicate. Too often these initiatives stay in the engineering departments, and face it, we're not always the best communicators. So looking to education, to psychology, if you have a department that deals with policy making, to get those people involved and look at the some of the IT communications areas as well. How do we reach out to connect to multiple generations and do that in an effective as well as somewhat cost-effective way? I'd say that's something that's not been done, and that could be very unique.
Walter, piggybacking on Joe's comment, one thought that just comes to mind is also workforce development. We talk about this offline quite a bit. And if you're talking about Smart One Water, besides the usual context of workforce development, I think we've got to place an emphasis on the workforce that is entering the utility system today across the universities in the country, from across the universities in the country. And if we talk about Smart One Water, it's no longer, water resources and water treatment, but it's also about water governance. It's about communications. It's about data. So that interdisciplinary approach to education needs to be somewhat looked at with a bigger magnifying glass, if I can go on a limb and say that, because these are the folks who are going to be embracing the newer technologies. These are the folks who are going to be tasked with the burden of decluttering the noise that sometimes hits us from all sides, right? I mean, George said that, and everyone else has said it. There's a lot of initiatives out there. There's a lot of technologies out there, and they're not all the same for everyone. So as we talk about accelerating the adoption of technologies and innovation, we also have to place a very strong emphasis on the younger workforce that's coming into our organizations. And when we talk about inclusivity and we talked about diversity, I think there needs to be a great emphasis on that mentorship, so to speak, that we are consciously doing that. And we are also talking to our academic institutions that there might be a need for us to adapt even more so in the post-pandemic world to see how we can make those changes in our educational curriculum, so to speak, so that these guys don't have that on-the-job training dilemma. They should come armed with some of these tools and resources that we talk about in forums like these and others.
Yeah, that was a good point you make there, Hardeep. I think that Raja Kadiyala earlier was talking about different personas in the utilities as well. So you have different ways of working, and how do you work with these people, and the skill sets that they bring, the new people bring are going to be varied. And I think that by broadening the horizon to get different skills in the utilities is just going to be a huge benefit for all of us.
McCullough and awkward silence.
Yes.
Lost Walter?
No, I'm still here. I think earlier we were talking about what should Dick Luthi mentioned one of the questions to ask is what should the system or the utilities look like in 2050? That would have a direct influence on the type of workforce we're recruiting now, and then also just what's the work environment going to be like then? Any thoughts on that one?
Sorry, go ahead.
This is Neil Gregg. And I wanted to go back. I would ask that question about the hook, and maybe I could just make a couple of comments and you could skip to Walter's point after that. But the dilemma that I see in putting a proposal together for the ERC with the things we're talking about here is that it's an engineering research center, and engineering is about technology primarily, regardless of how much we would like to broaden it, as we often do with good reason. But I thought the points that you all made were terrific about the need to work with the smaller communities and create networks that would work for them, have a way to scale it up, and so on. That's kind of an organizational thing. And the other side, the communication thing, to work with diverse groups, new entries to the workforce, work with stakeholders better, and so on. All of these things are a little bit outside of engineering. So looking for the hook that would distinguish this ERC from any other institution that we would be talking about, I think we're going to have to work hard to figure out how to shape that thing and make it an ERC, and how to include the participants in the ERC that could address this organizational issue, the communication issue, together with the technology to figure out how to wrap that together in a truly unique way. That's kind of my main point. It's not necessarily a question. I think all the responses so far were great. I just wanted to add that point.
Now, Walter, the comment both on what Neil said and in answer to your question, because I have my sense of when the question is, should we envision what a water utility should be in 2050? And I love doing the idea of my sense of strategic planning is anytime you spend too much time strategizing about a future that's far off, so many things change in the meantime that a lot of that strategy becomes irrelevant fairly quickly. And my sense of strategic planning is knowing where your horizon is and looking down at your feet where the next 2 or 3 steps are. And then you take those steps and then you look back up and make sure you're oriented to the horizon that you're seeking. And that's not that I'm saying anything of great wisdom here. That's what a lot of folks do. And the question is, how would the ERC do that? Because it does connect to some of the questions that have been asked previously in the chat and by participants here. If you had we want to see a water system that is completely energy efficient or has reduced, what are the big questions we like in the long term? And how do we dice them up into smaller, replicable, achievable strategies that we can apply intellect, apply research, apply implementation, communication, and education in the schools, and achieve some of those victories, and then look back up as to what's the next step we take on this path, and are we on the right path? And I think an ERC cycling between those two could be very successful.
Yeah, so more like a roadmap approach, have a distance, and then continue to reevaluate your steps as you're progressing on a journey.
And as Joe has been highlighting, telling that story every step. Here's what we did. Here's why it matters. Look what and show excitement and these are a lot of the topics with water are things that are very accessible to people when we think of them that way.
Yeah. Here's a question. Could the panel comment on the digital watershed approach?
Is that I'm wondering if that's the digital twin aspect of it. And if that's the case, I think it would be fair to say that by 2050, we should all be operating as digital twins of our physical systems.
Yeah, that was, well, yeah, this is a little bit different aspect, just a digital watershed as maybe Ting Lu talked about Clean Water Service, how they're, having the sensors and everything else throughout a watershed to make it a digital watershed as opposed just to a utility boundary.
Right.
I'll give you my quick answer is I love it. I mean, the challenge, I love the prospect. It's really hard to do, but we're certainly much more capable of doing it today than ever before, and it's evolving rapidly. When we were doing water, for any water utility, the most expensive place to reduce pollutants are at the facility itself. At Blue Plains, we spent $1 billion for reducing 1 milligram per liter from our discharge. And what we knew is that was a very small percentage of the pollutants going to the Chesapeake Bay, but the EPA could monitor it. It was part of our permit. It's where we had always gone. Most of the nutrient reduction that could be achieved at far less was upstream, but it wasn't as certain to be measured and understood as reducing it at the pipe at our facility, despite the enormous costs and affordability and challenges that our ratepayers faced, as well as the fact the environment wasn't protected. A digital watershed offers the information that could allow reductions upstream to be done with almost as much certainty as the pipe that comes out of the treatment plant. And the prospect is less money doing far more protection. And it saves money it improves the Chesapeake Bay or anywhere else. So I'm tremendously excited. I wonder how an ERC could help elevate and expand on that kind of approach, because that is big data, and that is technology adoption, new techniques in communication and all the rest. But I think the prospect is extraordinary.
I'm going to sound like a broken record and say that I like George's message about loving the prospect. I mean, I think it's a great idea. The challenge always is that how do we justify the additional expense that's required to do that, given the budgets that we operate in? So I sound like a broken record in that we have to get people aware of what the benefit is so they can see why they're going to have to pay more, but they're not going to get any more water. The benefit is bigger than that. And that's something that's not a quick sell. One of the things I tell folks about is well drilling. I mean, the best well drilling in the world is done by the oil industry. And a lot of the things we use today comes from that. Why is it they were able to explore and develop new and innovative techniques? Because the money was there to make it happen. But that same funding level has never existed in the water sector. And we have to figure out how to get people behind it.
I mean, a digital watershed could end up being cheaper in the long run, because if it's taking the expense away from treating it in a plant and dealing with the contamination upstream of it, you have the benefits also of reducing costs of treatment. You improve water quality along the throughout the watershed. Local communities will benefit too in ways if you're improving the watershed in various manners. So I think you may not reduce the expense completely, but you may shift it into more beneficial societal benefits.
But you have to package that message so that
Yep.
other people that are paying for it will say, okay, I agree with you, not that you're trying to sell me something.
Right.
And that's a challenge.
Could I comment on that quickly? I think that's an exciting idea, and it might have the seed of answering the question that I asked a few minutes ago about the hook. In a lot of ways, the digital watershed, the way George explained it, is similar to what's emerging in smart agriculture. And you're talking about optimizing the total agricultural field by connecting all the information resources together. But that's a situation where there's usually a single governance authority. Here we've got three issues that you could pull together, and they would fit engineering. Number one would be the technology of the digital watershed itself. Number two would be figuring out the willingness part, which I think Joe said something about, the willingness part for the different players to participate. And then number three would be to figure out a governance strategy and a financing strategy that would really work in there. None of that would be easy, but it could be the kind of glue that could be really appealing for an ERC.
This Walter again. I think one thing about this is it moves towards more of a smart one water type idea, because then you're looking at surface water, you're looking at stormwater, drinking water, wastewater type issues. And also, as far as the cost savings goes, some communities have the consent decree that really gets them focused on how to save some money on these monster penalties they're going to have to face if they can't come up with a better way of dealing with their particular issues.
Yeah, I was going to add that, I think Cincinnati MSD is a great example of the potential cost savings you go using the digital approach. They've decreased their wastewater OCS overflows by 750 million gallons a year at a cost of a penny a gallon just through digitalization of their watershed. And that the typical hard cost would have been 40 cents to $1 a gallon. So I think it definitely can be can be paid for and very cost effectively. But again, you have to be able to demonstrate those paybacks. I agree, Joe, that's real important to be able to do that and get that message out.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ken. I love the Cincinnati story. I love the South Bend story, Buffalo, a lot of places. There are a lot of technologies I wish we had evaluated more thoroughly at DC Water at the time, but we were making decisions before they really came forward. I'll give you another very interesting one. And the question, I love this notion of what an ERC could do about the technology itself. Can we have a digital, and how would it work? How does it connect to the coalition of the willing, those who are willing to undertake actions as a result of that knowledge? What is it that they should do as the result of the knowledge, and how do we communicate it and generate positive reactions? I think that an ERC could be part of all of those steps. But I'll tell you an interesting one that's happening now in Iowa. There are metropolitan wastewater treatment facilities paying to sequester carbon by reducing nutrients upstream in farmland. This is being brokered through the Soybean Association. Turns out that it didn't make sense. They were going to do a creative financing instrument. It's a company called Quantified Ventures, who worked with us in the Environmental Impact Bond. Turns out that other major companies were willing to pay to sequester carbon as part of their carbon goals that added some value in to reducing nutrients upstream, that made the deal work, that investors were willing to pay the cost and have cargo pay the cost. I don't know all of the details, but that's the kind of innovative approach that is now being supported by this technology adoption that even 4 or 5 years ago probably wasn't possible.
Yeah, I love the idea. I love pollutant trading, be able to go upstream, help to reduce it there. And definitely, like I said, George, downstream costs are incredibly high to have to address it there. Just a question to the group. What would be the value? The question, there's a question early on. What should the ERC focus on first? Should we be looking at developing the strategic approach to help a regional group or a utility become a smart one water organization, and then work with 1 or 2 to help them develop that plan for themselves so they have a path forward as a way to demonstrate to the water community how it could be done?
Yeah, Ken, I love the idea, Ken. I think there are organizations that are doing things like that. I think what the question would be, what could the ERC add that's unique? That's been a question that we've seen. And Joe's focus on presenting the case and finding the coalition of the willing and communicating properly about about how it's done. And as well as the back and forth of the constant innovation and connection to the academic resources that a university could bring to bear, because there will always be implementation challenges along the way, and to evolve quickly. I think the ERC could be not only taking a model, but making sure it's a living model and always evolving, because that's my sense of university research. It's always building upon itself, always the new, always keeping abreast, and it would be probably relevant in this case, in this situation.
And, you know, George, I think we're all getting into this agile approach across the board. And I think it'd be very important. We have to be constantly evolving. Otherwise, it's just not going to work, because digitalization is evolving so quickly that even to produce a 10-year plan is going to be outdated after 3 or 5 years.
Walter, I believe Christobel has some questions. He has raised hand.
Okay, yes, Christabel.
I was just going to say that there's an example in Australia where we did actually pull together all of the water data and basically create a data lake, more or less. And it was done through a legislative mechanism, but the important thing, and a couple of people have mentioned this already, is you have to have a champion. You have to kind of have like the willing agency who can actually take that on. In Australia, the federal government gave funds to the Bureau of Meteorology. So the water information is all actually collected by the states, and it's reported through the Bureau of Meteorology with all the climate data and other natural resource management data. It's all fed up to the one agency, and then it's provided free of charge to everybody. So it actually means that it really helps those impoverished communities that can't afford to go out and collect all that data. All the data is actually available for the whole country. The whole thing was precipitated by the Millennium Drought. So a good crisis was the opportunity to actually convince the government and the politicians that this was a worthwhile investment. It cost $400 million, which at the time sounded like a lot of money. And a lot of that money went to the individual states to actually put in place the infrastructure and the reporting and the data warehousing that needed to be done to get the information all in the standard format. And that was the hardest part of the project. It took 10 years, but the return on investment has already been achieved several times over. So it's definitely something that is well worth looking at. I've put the website in the chat area if you want to have a look at it. It might give you some ideas of a piece of work. Of course, not saying that you would have to do the whole thing that's there, but it might give you some ideas of an approach that could be implemented here. Obviously, America's a lot bigger than Australia, so I'd recommend that you would just maybe do it in one state, maybe just take it on in one area to start with. But yeah, anyway, it's an example that could be looked at.
Thank you, Christabel. Okay, Pierre had some more comments. You want to chip in with some more, Pierre?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think it's, anything that hasn't really been said yet, but in terms of the ERC, I think, putting a bit of effort into identifying some exciting technologies, but the exciting technologies that don't necessarily require an awful lot of resources, to implement, would be really good. And so it's sort of that idea of kind of creating a roadmap, having that more distant goal that's very exciting and so forth, but also having each step. I like the analogy that George used, right? Keep have your eye on the longer term goal, but also look at your feet. And so having some excitement in those few steps that you can take, or that a small community can take, that's really important. And so and I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that. I unfortunately I missed a lot of the sessions, but everything that's being done was in terms of real-time sensing and sensors, things that could be done in terms of visualizations, right? How some communities are doing a better job with visualizing their optimization of their water management, whether it's wastewater management or other types of management. Those can be really exciting and not necessarily something that's really expensive, right, to implement, and something that you know, to some extent, maybe able to be brought into some of these smaller communities. And I'm sure there's some other examples, and so I think part of the effort should be to think about that. What are those exciting small steps that can be taken?
Yeah.
I'll throw something.
No, go ahead.
I was going to throw something out, following up on what was just said about small steps. Too often we talk about a digital watershed and having lots of sensors and however that evolves. But sometimes we develop these and it takes somebody that's well experienced or very, very research oriented to understand what's coming out of it. I mean, our goal is that we want to, I don't dumb them down, it's not the right answer, but to make the output in common language so that people don't have to have a PhD to be able to work with 150 sensors and go through the analysis. So I think that that's a small step, is to look at when you move to a digital watershed, what is it that you're trying to show that the operator of a water treatment plant or the community planner for a medium-sized city who may not be a water resources professional can use to shape the decisions they have to make.
Joe, just to add to that point, I'm sure Debbie Greiner, she's the resilience manager for Miami-Dade County. She probably presented yesterday, Sunil, and maybe you can share that presentation with everyone down the road. We had participated in an effort with the Rockefeller Foundation and the 100 Resilient Cities, precisely along the lines of the watershed and being able to bring all of the stakeholder bodies together, because even though we talk of a digital watershed, a pure digital watershed, let's say in the foreseeable future, as we stand today, several stakeholder bodies, for instance, over here, it's the Department of Health, the Department of Environmental Protection, and many other local jurisdictions. We all collect data to regulate, monitor, or implement our own systems within the box that we are confined with. And I think a good start in that direction, which was the recommendations of the study from the 100RC, was let's enable all this data into some sort of a collaborative data portal that will start informing the decisions. And the decisions we started off with like 1,500 odd indicators. We brought them down to like, I think 50 plus indicators, but those indicators started translating into some dimensions and objectives, going back to the point that depending on where you are in the ecosystem, you might be an operator or you might be an elected official. So how are you able to decipher information from raw data into actionable data, right? And being able to connect those stories so that you're then able to take actions and mitigate risks in somewhat of a real time. So, while the whole digital watershed conversation might be an expensive proposition at the moment, both from a standpoint of visualizing what the solution is and what, for everyone to understand and kind of rally behind it, I think a good start in that direction would be for the ERC to host this big data portal, create an environment where participating utilities or entities that have any data, water quality, water quantity, should be able to share that data so that then that data could be parsed and be available back onto iPads and desktops or mobile phones through the technologies that we have today in our systems. And I think that would be a great way to showcase not repeating the data that we collect, but also collaborating on the data that we collect. And is it meaningful? And what kind of insights can we draw from it? So that is something that I wanted to just share, because we had started the phase 1 and phase 2 with the 100RC, and we would be exploring the implementation of phase 3, hopefully with the Biscayne Bay and other water bodies within Miami-Dade County in the foreseeable future.